Oh, you childish and silly Ukrainians, hoping for your country's liberation. Don't you know that it's impossible for you to beat the mighty, superior Russian military and its nuclear arsenal? It's not like anyone has ever done that before. Let's start with the instance that I feel that I'm more morally obliged to respond to. So the person I'm about to respond to is this woman right here. I've already forgotten her name. I can't believe I've already forgotten her name. But she was somebody that I thought was a somewhat reasonable libertarian for a period of time. Her name is Hannah Cox. The end of our disagreement ended with me being blocked. She posted a tweet where she said that Trump's promise of abandonment to Ukraine was good. She said that it was the only reasonable take and that, everybody was flipping out because of it. And she said a few things, which we're going to now break down. But I disagreed with it. I pointed out my disagreement on Twitter. I'm pretty sure that it was my original quote tweet of her that got a lot of people in the quote unquote NATO sphere or the pro-Ukraine sphere to go into her replies. And they, of course, were not nearly as cordial as I was, and which led to her saying things like calling Ukrainians entitled, that these entitled Ukrainians want American aid, and da-da-da. And then using terms like entitled Ukrainians, of course, when you're talking about a community that reviews videos every day of Russian war crimes and mass graves and all of these horrendous atrocities, they did not take well to her calling Ukrainians entitled, to talking about the entitled Ukrainians. And then the response to her only got more vitriolic. And now she has opened up the block gun and has blocked everybody, me included. So I got capped. And so whether or not I can sympathize with the fact that getting dogpiled sucked, that does not take away from the value or substance behind the critiques I originally made of her position on Donald Trump's speech or his statement, which could be really amounted to, on day one of my administration, I will abandon support for Ukraine, as he dodged many of the questions. So let's watch her original short video that she posted on social media, basically supporting Trump's position that I had problems with. Maybe if I lay out my problems with it here, it can be more easy to be interpreted by those who just saw the vitriolic reaction to what she had to say on Twitter.
CNN just held a town hall with former President Trump, and I want to talk about his comments that he made regarding the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Here's the problem.
Russian invasion of Ukraine, but continue.
We've given so far $171 billion. They've given, meaning European Union, which is approximately the same size altogether as our economy. They've given about 20. So we're at 170, let's say, and they're at 20.
The numbers are not really right here. It is true that as a total amount, the United States has given more than I would even say, I think the entirety of Europe. But if you go to a lot of the individual countries, like Poland, for example, we've given Ukraine something around like, I think 50 to 70 tanks, only 31 out of our own supply Abrams tanks, which still have yet to be delivered. Poland has delivered something like 300 to 500 tanks. As a percentage of its own GDP, Poland has given, if not equivalent to us, very close to the equivalent to us. Some nations in Europe, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, states that are most directly impacted by Russian invasion, by the threat of future Russian invasions, they have been giving a higher percentage of support than their GDP compared to our GDP. It's just that in comparison, the United States has more military funds, more of these equipment, of these tanks, of these machines built and advanced, where most of our military aid is not, oh, we need to make this and give it to you, or, oh, we're selling you top of the line gear. Most of our aid is we're selling them. Not really selling them, we're giving them. A lot of our older gear that we're not going to use anyway, a lot of Vietnam era troop transporters, for example, that we're just saying is worth its original value. And then we're also including the supplemental costs, which means us buying a replacement for ourselves. We're including that in the aid to Ukraine. So the way he gets the numbers like 170 billion, I don't know how he got to that number, because even if you include supplemental costs, even if you include the original items, military items we gave to Ukraine at their original value when they were made 16, 70 years ago, and you don't take into consideration how they've depreciated in value since then, even if you do all of those fudging of the numbers, you still don't even get close to the number that Donald Trump is putting forward. So I don't know exactly where he got this number from. But as a total percentage of GDP, many European states have actually given more than us, and we're seeing them continue to give more and support Ukraine in ways that we didn't. For example, the United Kingdom, even though they've given less than us, they were the first to send over tanks, modern Western tanks, which pushed other countries like the United States eventually to send tanks. We still have yet to send long-range missiles to Ukraine. We haven't taken that diplomatic risk. And there are some documents that have been leaked by Politico suggesting that we haven't taken those risks because we've made it private commitments to nation states like China in return to them not sending Ukraine military aid. But the UK, using its more, flexibility on the international stage, because it hasn't made these types of commitments behind closed doors, and it seems to be more eager to send certain types of aids and to call the Russians bluff, they sent the Storm Shadow missile, which is the longer range missile that has a range of 250 kilometers, I would say, 250, 260 kilometers, something in that range, which can strike the Crimean Kerch Bridge, which the Russians use to transport goods into Crimea. That can strike basically all of Russian forces in Ukraine, that the United States was nervous to give the Russians. We were nervous to give our own long-range missiles because we were scared they were going to use it in Russian territory, and therefore they could implicate us in those types of attacks. We didn't take that risk. The British did. And so I think the way that he boils down this conflict to, America cares while Europe is lazy, I think it generalizes Europe, which is not one collective entity like the United States. The European Union is an economic union at the end of the day. It is not a single country, no matter how much Emmanuel Macron kind of wants it to be like that when it functions with its own military and air force. That just isn't the case. Some European countries have been more supportive. Other European countries have been less supportive. Many of them don't have old stockpiles like the United States have. And it's also not talking about the political risks that many European states have taken and how certain European states have provided support that the United States can't. Poland and a lot of these post-Soviet states has equipment, has ammunition stockpiles that the United States just cannot provide Ukraine. We don't have 300 T-72 tanks just waiting in a storage unit in the middle of Nevada. What we have waiting for us in the middle of Nevada is going to be Abrams tanks, which has a much heavier logistical workload, which is going to take a ton of training for Ukrainian troops to get a hold on, and is going to need a different type of ammunition as well, which the Ukrainians don't have standardized in the Ukrainian military as of right now. The Poles do have a lot of these old Soviet tanks. A lot of other countries like Hungary do have these old Soviet tanks. Obviously, the Hungarians are not going to be as supportive of sending aid. But the thing that really gets me is that a lot of Trump's political allies in Europe, like Viktor Orban, for example, are the exact people who are trying to hold back more military aid and to stop the Europeans from sending more aid over to Ukraine, and are personally keeping all of their aid in their pockets. And those are the people that Trump has a most favorable view of in European politics, are the same people that he should be criticizing more than anyone else. Anyway, let's continue.
You don't have to know too much about history to realize, or geography, to realize that.
Also, I think I can point out the $2.7 billion in aid that Germany has recently committed, which includes more tanks, which includes more anti-air, includes a lot of stuff that Ukraine needs, which is, I think, one of the most, if not the most substantive German aid package to date. We can also talk about the nation states outside of Europe that have provided support, which of course Trump didn't include in his analysis. He didn't talk about the $5 billion. That's 25% of the $20 billion number he put forward. Again, not the most accurate of number, but that's $5 billion from the Japanese for this year. We have the South Koreans promising to refill over 500,000 shells in American stockpiles so we can free up more space for us to send more shells to Ukraine. There's a lot of other allies that are not being talked about in this discussion as well. The Australians are not being talked about. Anyway, let's continue.
They're a little bit more affected than we are, okay? So they've got to put up a lot more money because they're taking advantage of us like every other country did.
So we'll just pause here and say that he's absolutely correct on this front. The U.S. is spending way more on this conflict than people who are actually affected by it, people who actually have it in their backyard. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Those dollars should have been kept here in the U.S. and used for our own people. I don't know when we're going to learn our lesson.
Okay, so first off, we have more means to help. So I do think it makes more sense that we are helping on a larger scale. Nobody seriously is going to recommend Estonia to send more money to Ukraine than the United States, even if Estonia is more affected by the conflict, because Estonia has about 1.8 million people in it. The United States has 330 million people in it, and also a full nuclear arsenal and the most powerful military that God has ever seen, right? Secondly, he said we should have kept this money in the United States and spent it on our own people. A lot of these vehicles, and this is the main problem that I think a lot of these libertarian types run into, and they don't know how to maneuver around it. A lot of these vehicles, like these old Vietnam era vehicles we're sending over, these are pre-made. Those 31 Abrams tanks, how do we use those on our own people? I mean, I know one way we could use tanks on our own people, but I don't think she, as a libertarian, or me, as somebody with vaguely liberal values, would be okay with that. So I don't think you want to use the tanks on the homeless. I'm against it. Hopefully she's against it. So how do you use these weapons on our own people to help them? Do we melt down the tanks? Do we melt down these armored military vehicles that we were never going to use, and we're just going to sit down and rot away in our old stockpiles? And this is something I'm critical of the Israeli government, because the Israeli government uses some of the same concerns in its own objection to not sending military aid over. But the stuff that's being asked of the Israeli government, a lot of its air defense systems from the 60s and 70s, stuff they're just not using anymore, that could be over there right now saving lives. Over there in Ukraine, shooting out these Russian missiles that I hear on the daily basis in the Kiev Oblast that are terrorizing the civilian population. But as I've said before of the Israeli government, I think their international dedication to democracy is not nearly as much as they claim. But this idea that a lot of this money, which has already been allocated in many instances for the military and for Ukraine, could then be taken, these old vehicles in many instances that are already made, and just like converted to help the homeless. I don't think that's true. Not to mention, many of the proposals that I would make and many people would make in order to support the homeless, to support hungry people in the United States, to support hungry veterans on the street in the United States, I have a hard time believing that that this libertarian would end up supporting those proposals as well. It feels like it would be like that old comic people always see on Twitter. We need to stop spending all this money on the foreign aid. So can we spend it on our own people? Fuck off. Not my problem. I feel like we would get into one of these problems as well. Like, does she support universal housing? Does she support spending more money to publicly fund mental health care programs to deal with not only the homelessness crisis in this country, because we have a lot of homeless, mentally ill people, but also to help try to deal with gun violence in this country, the issue of mass shootings, which is, as much as it's, many people could say it's a gun control problem, it's also a mental health problem. Like, what are the policies that this libertarian is going to support using this other money for? Because I feel like a lot of it's going to be tax cuts, tax credits.
On involving ourselves in conflicts that do not pertain to us, but it should have been about, 85 years ago. But there's more. Also,
we signed a Budapest Memorandum saying that we would do everything to support the sovereignty of Ukraine if they were invaded. We signed this. It was an agreement we signed with them, what would then become Russia and Ukraine, us, Ukraine, and Russia. We would respect their territorial sovereignty in order for them to give up nuclear weapons, which I thought was a good thing. I like the end of states having nuclear weapons. I don't like expanding the amount of countries that have nuclear weapons. I think that's dangerous. The more countries that have nuclear weapons, the more chances there are for an incident to happen, a country not to properly invest in its upkeep, and there possibly being a disaster. But if a country is going to willingly give up its nuclear weapons, I feel like we should set the international standard that if that does happen, that country will be supported. Because now in the future, when it ever gets talked about, hey, these weapons that could end the world, we should get rid of them once and for all, people are going to remember, well, I remember there was this one country that got rid of the nuclear weapons, and what happened to them? Oh yeah, that's right. They got invaded because they didn't have nuclear weapons. I think there should be a standard shown by the international community that if you give up these weapons, you will be supported and you will not be undercut. This is something that could really compromise nuclear non-proliferation for years if we do not properly support Ukraine in its time of crisis after it signed this agreement, which we made ourselves a member to. We went out of our way to do it because we saw that how this not only benefited us, but also the whole world to have less states with these types of world-ending arsenals.
The moderator kept pushing Trump and trying to make him say if he wanted Ukraine or Russia to quote, quote, win this conflict. Let's roll this clip.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of...
Can I just say, there has never been a more obvious lie from Donald Trump than the words, I don't think in terms of winning and losing. There is nobody in the United States who more clearly thinks in terms of winning and losing, who the winners are and who the losers are, than Donald J. Trump. That's all he ever talks about. This is just such a bold-faced lie.
Getting it settled so we stop killing all these people and breaking down this country. Now,
What do you, can I just follow up on that? You said you don't think in terms of winning and losing. Mr. President, can I just follow up on that because that's a really important
excuse me,
statement
let me
that you
just
just
follow
made
up.
there. Can you say if you want Ukraine or Russia to win this war?
I want everybody to stop dying. They're dying. Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying.
Can I just say, that is some of the most shallow commentary you could possibly have about any war. You see for example, let's say we see what's happening in Myanmar, right, where the government is genociding its own people. It is taking Muslims and expelling them out of villages. It is bombing village after village that could support the democratically elected leadership that was couped. It is engaged in just campaigns of going through villages, burning them to the ground, raping anybody in them, if they show even the slightest of support anywhere in the village for the rebellion. In some instances, not even any support, but just being in the proximity of the rebellion will have that type of atrocities done to you. And then somebody's asked, do you support the democratic rebellion or do you support the government? I support the end of violence. I support like less people dying. It's unbelievably shallow analysis, because in order for the violence to stop, the military junta has to go. Not to mention, even if you can get the violence, the high levels of violence currently now to stop without getting rid of the junta, what type of status quo are you going to have? Is the violence really stopped? No, because the junta is still going to kidnap people off the street. It's still going to torture people. It's still going to engage in a genocide against the Rohingya Muslims. It's still going to engage in all the atrocities that we know that it's engaged in. And so is that a real peace, or is that a peace on the government's terms? And so when we talk about that in the conflict in Ukraine, Trump in the past has called this war a genocide. A month into it, he called it a genocide. He's not the only one to use that word. The New Lines Institute published a report like almost a year ago talking about the risk of genocide. And since then, their case has only gotten stronger because much of their case was built upon the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and them being indoctrinated. The International Criminal Court now has put out a warrant for Vladimir Putin for his arrest for the kidnapping of Ukrainian children and their indoctrination with Russia as they try to stop them from speaking Ukrainian, as they abuse them and allegations of abuse come out, and they're preventing them from returning to their homes. And they brag about it on Russian state television, brag about it on Russian state TV. And so if you are claiming from Donald Trump, as he claimed a month into this war, that there is a genocide going on, and you're not saying, I want the people who are being genocided to win, then not only do I find you to be somebody of low character, I also just find you to be somebody who's not serious about this. Because on one hand, when it was politically convenient at the start of this, he says it's a genocide. When everybody was asking him for a response, because many people see him as close to Putin, they wanted to make sure he would have a strong response. He gives a strong response. A year later, everybody forgets about it. Nobody's asking him, wait, you don't want to send weapons to the people who are being murdered? We don't want to send weapons to the people who are being genocided? What does never again mean to you? Because he used the word genocide, not me. Okay, he was the one who used it. That's deeply immoral, but it also feels like he's not even holding himself to the words he used earlier in this war. He just completely forgot about it because he's not wanting to thinking in terms of winning and losing. It's just very shallow analysis. Some wars should be won. Some wars need victory, because not only does it stop the violence when you win the war, but also the goals you're being fought for. It's better for your society. It's the more moral goal, and it can stop violence in the future. Because if the war was stopped right now, we just drove the lines in, as I feel a lot of American libertarians want. Just the lines of the current border, it is what it is. It's not going to stop the violence. There will still be torture. There will still be mass graves. There will still be extrajudicial killings. There'll still be mass deportation of children. There'll still be indoctrination. There'll still be the arrest of political dissidents. There'll still be extrajudicial, of course it's not judicial rape, but rape. All these different crimes will still be happening in occupied territory. And there's a really good chance that there'll just be another war 5 years down the road, either because there's some rebellion from within occupied territory that doesn't want to take it anymore, or because the Russians want more, and they always want more. Just like we saw in Chechnya, just like we saw in Georgia, just like we saw in Ukraine in 2014, and just like we saw in Ukraine in 2022. That is the policy of the current administration, is the complete dominance of the post-Soviet sphere. That is Putin's government.
Now, I think he brilliantly responded to this, because the truth is there is no winning this conflict. And this reveals a huge break between the left and most people on the right now. The left thinks that Ukraine should outright win this war, and that is a childish and simplistic wish. The reality is Ukraine cannot defeat a nuclear superpower. And in trying to do so, it will require billions of more dollars from around the world. It will take countless lives, and it will risk a nuclear conflict.
Okay, so now that I'm listening to this again, honestly, I have probably less sympathy for her and the way that people responded to her, because she's so condescending about it too. Just the way she talks about it. Oh, you childish and silly Ukrainians hoping for your country's liberation. Don't you know that it's impossible for you to beat the mighty, superior Russian military and its nuclear arsenal? It's not like anyone has ever done that before. Not like the Chechens have done that before, or the Afghans have done that before. What did the Lebanese do to the Israeli army that was backed by a nuclear arsenal? They fought and they fought and they fought, and eventually the Israelis left. Was it the victory they necessarily completely wanted? No. But it shows that just because you have a nuclear arsenal, that isn't a get out of jail free card for losing in a conventional war. Hell, we're the United States. We should know this better than anyone. Vietnam, Afghanistan. We have gone into a lot of conflicts where we thought, oh, we are the mighty, powerful United States. Surely these ragtag group of rebels can't beat us. And they did it without HIMARS. They did it without a contested airspace. The Taliban had no air force. The Viet Cong didn't have an air force to stop us. We had complete air superiority in Vietnam. We had complete air superiority in Afghanistan. The Soviets had complete air superiority in Afghanistan. The Russians had complete air superiority in Chechnya. And yet, in all of these instances, a nuclear superpower ended up coming short. Same thing is true in Lebanon as well. Complete air superiority, the IDF Air Force. So the idea that it's a childish and ridiculous thing to think a nuclear superpower could possibly be beaten by a smaller, less conventionally powerful force, when we just had this happen like 2 years ago with the Taliban to us. We are a direct recipient of that type of a beatdown, and we say, no, that's impossible. It's a childlike fantasy. It's almost like she came out of a coma. She completely missed the last 20 years of the war in Afghanistan. Just blindsided it. That she's just checked in to Russian foreign policy after 20 years. Completely ignored the first Chechen war. It's silly. What the Russians are doing is they're trying to move the goalpost from, oh, our territory itself, the internationally recognized territory of Russia, if that is threatened, we use a nuclear arsenal. They're trying to move that goalpost to, oh, well, actually, if you try to counter our invasion in Ukraine and send aid to Ukraine, then we will use our nukes. We're not going to make any strong commitments. We're not going to be doing the actual moves on the ground in order to move towards that goal. But, you know, we will make that threat openly. And we're supposed to be scared enough to back off of that threat, even though backing off that threat shows them that that threat works. Then they'll go off and do more of that threat when they get cornered. And other tin box dictators in the world will go race to go get nuclear weapons. All this does is proliferate nuclear weapons in the long term, worse later on. This is just going to make more tin pot dictators and the Russians think, oh, we can literally lose a war in every single way. And all we have to do is say, we will blow up the world, and they'll just give us whatever we want. They'll just give us whatever we want. Like they've just dumped the entire basket of Halloween candy into our bag. And all we had to say was, we'll blow up the world. There doesn't even need to be any force behind it, actually. You just say that, and you cave. It's ridiculous. It just feels like she did no research on the history of conflict between non-nuclear states and nuclear states and just came to a conclusion that a basic retelling of the history of the life that she's been alive to live. This isn't even ancient history. This is history from the last 3 years of us pulling out of Afghanistan shows that yes, non-nuclear states can beat nuclear states. And the Ukrainians have had a lot more success than the Taliban did in the early time. In the early period of the war, of the American invasion of Afghanistan, that was the period when American power seemed most dominant in Afghanistan. Same thing when it comes to Iraq. Same things when it comes to Vietnam as well. It was the later war period where that started to fall apart more and more and more. The Russians haven't even gotten to that stage. They haven't even occupied like half the country. They've occupied, I think, what, like 20% of the country at this point? 15 to 20% of the country? And they've run into these kind of problems? And we say it's impossible? They can't even hold on to 2/3 or 1/2 or 2/5. They're barely holding on to 1/5 of the country. And we're saying it's impossible that the Ukrainians win. No, I'm not saying that the Ukrainians are 100% guaranteed to win. No. In fact, I talk to Ukrainian soldiers all the time who say the people who assume that we have already achieved victory due to how the Russians have humiliated themselves up to this point, they're wrong. This war and the results of it are very much still in the air and are largely dependent upon the tools that are given to the people who want to defend themselves. But after seeing the Ukrainians dash all the predictions of the expert armchair analysts who said that the country would collapse in a week, then they said, no, maybe not a week, maybe it'll be a month, well, maybe 2 months, before eventually the Russian army was pushed back from Kiev. And then they're like, well, they were able to stop them from taking Kiev, but they won't be able to launch a counteroffensive. And then the counteroffensive at Kharkiv, pushing the Russians completely out of the Kharkiv Oblast when the Russians thought they could take that city in 2 days. Then the response was, no, that was a fluke. That was a fluke. They can't do it again. And then they did it again in Kherson. And now, on the eve of another counteroffensive, as the Ukrainians have already retaken over 50% of the territory taken from them since the February 24th invasion. And now we hear, well, this next counteroffensive will surely fail. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I think if I was a betting man, I would have already lost a lot of money, like a lot of other people, underselling the Ukrainian estimates of victory, the Ukrainian ability to push the Russians back here, especially when equipped with the right equipment. So I'm not going to be the one to say that that's impossible when a bunch of ragtag guerrillas in caves could defeat us after 20 years of bombing the countryside. And we're saying that the Russians, unable to garner air superiority, unable to achieve any of their original objectives, and on the back foot, on the defensive in the Zaporozhye Oblast, we're going to say, no, it's impossible that the Ukrainians could win. Honestly, it feels like some people haven't been paying attention to the last year and a half of what's been happening on the ground. It feels like Hannah just kind of checked into the war momentarily because Trump brought it up. It's in the search algorithm, made a bunch of historical claims that she can't back up, and continued to make the same prediction that analysts have been getting wrong since the start of this war. What's this? What has been sent to me by Evil City?
On my radar. Oh, it's just a Kinsel. hypersonic ballistic missile rapidly approaching an exact position. Oh my God, it's so fast, I'm terrified. Even this MIM-104 Patriot missile system can't intercept it. Oh wait, I was wrong. It turns out that it can. Oh, you're traveling at 3,500 meters per second. That's nice. My phased array tracking radar still gives my Patriot enough time to wipe its dick on your mom's curtains before launching a PAC-3 missile that will rapidly intercept your Kinsel at a precise location where it currently isn't. Russia's new strategic defense weapons? Wow. It must use some kind of advanced tech like a scramjet or in-flight maneuvering. Oh wait, it turns out it's just a regular ballistic missile that goes fast. Why don't you go back to your manufacturer and come back once you have something interesting that wasn't developed 50 years ago by that sorry excuse you call a military-industrial complex. The only thing complex about it is the convoluted way you go about acquiring Western chips for your missiles. Your acquisition companies use more shells than a fucking Matryoshka doll.
Okay, that's enough. That's enough. That's enough. I don't want to get too distracted. That was funny though. Let's finish this.
That could get all of us killed. That is Bush Cheney level insanity.
It is Bush Cheney level insanity. Okay, Bush illegally invaded Iraq for weapons of mass destruction that are not even there. It is Bush level Cheney level insanity to say that the United States should respect the agreement it made at the end of the Cold War with Ukraine, support them in pushing back an invasion that is an illegal invasion that the Russians have done, in part because they claimed that Ukraine had weapons of mass destruction. The Russians are doing what Bush and Cheney said they were trying to do in Iraq. Right now, into Ukraine, I don't even want to get through the rest of the moral implications. Of course, the deporting of the children and the more Russian nationalistic, grandstanding. But I don't know. I feel like in an attempt that has missed the forest for the trees, she's not seeing the fact that, no, it is the Russians that are taking the Bush-Cheney position, and it is us that is taking the position of the international community. It is completely legal for us to send aid, the military aid that we're sending Ukraine, in part because they are using these weapons in a defensive manner in a defensive war. It is not Bush-Cheney level insanity to say that the Ukrainians should be able to win a defensive war when the Russians are engaged in what Trump calls a genocide.
The best outcome that can be hoped for is a peaceful negotiation between these two parties. So Trump is right to stay neutral here, because if you say that you want Ukraine or Russia to win, guess what? They're not going to come to the table and have that peaceful talk. But the thing
is, Trump's position and America's position should not be as the neutral arbiter. That's a terrible way to use the amount of leverage we have here. There's also, libertarians can never negotiate on the international stage. They just, not only due to a lack of knowledge about the issues that are going to be talked about, but just this unending position of, oh, we have to be the neutral arbiter. What if we can benefit one of these sides, maybe the good side, the moral side, by leveraging our international position behind them and the amount of aid that we still could give them and the aid that we already have given them? If we say we're the neutral arbiter, we don't support Ukraine, we don't support Russia, Ukraine's going to lose large swaths of its leverage in any negotiations with Russia, which means that it won't be able to negotiate for more territory, it won't be able to negotiate from a position of strength, and we're undercutting and straight up abandoning the Ukrainians. Donald Trump's position is the full-throated abandonment of Ukraine. And I think a lot of people don't want to put it like that, but that is exactly what his position is. If we remove our leverage behind the Ukrainians, many of the things that they could achieve through the supposed negotiation, which I've already talked about extensively on other videos about how I don't think these negotiations would work right now, how the Russian position and the Ukrainian position are irreconcilable at the current time, and any negotiation would just end to kicking the can down the road and passing this war down to our children, which I'm not interested in doing. I think most people in Ukraine, the vast majority of, according to polling, are interested in doing. We should be behind them, giving them leverage for negotiations which they could then use to defend their country. We should not be the neutral arbiter.
Moderator keeps pushing because for most in the media and most on the left, they don't want peaceful negotiations. Again, they want to, quote, quote, win this war. Next, she tries to push Trump.
Again, quote, unquote, win this war. I don't know if, libertarians, libertarians have generally not been involved in many foreign policy victories. And so maybe it's hard for them to imagine winning a war or achieving something, but something should be fought for. Some wars are worth fighting, like in self-defense, which this war is. The non-aggression principle has been clearly violated by one state towards another state, and we signed an agreement saying we would support that state. And here is America trying to find some way, well, certain people in the United States, thankfully most Americans don't agree with her position, trying to find some way to wiggle out of supporting Ukraine, even though the Ukrainians are winning. We are desperately trying to grasp defeat out of the clutches of victory.
Saying that Putin is a war criminal.
Do you believe that he is a war criminal?
What?
Do you believe that Putin is a war criminal? He's responsible for the deaths of thousands of Ukrainian men and women and civilian children.
I think it's something that should not be discussed now. It should be discussed later, because right now we have to get a war. If you say he's a war criminal, it's going to be a lot tougher to make a deal to get this thing stopped. Because if he's going to be a war criminal where people are going to go and grab him and execute him, he's going to fight a lot harder than he's fighting, under the other circumstance. That's something to be discussed at a later date. Right now, we want to get that war settled. And I'm not talking about the money either. I'm talking about all the lives that are the number of people being killed in that war is far greater than you're hearing. When they blow up a city and those buildings come pouring down and then they say 2 people were injured, no, hundreds and thousands of people are being killed, and we have to get that war settled.
Again, why is Trump the adult in the room on this?
Dude, she doesn't even know anything about Trump himself, man.
It's bizarre. He's 100% right.
This doesn't even line up with what Trump himself has said about the war. A month into the war, he said that Putin was committing genocide in Ukraine. He said this war was genocide. A year later, the heat has died down, and now he won't even answer if Putin's a war criminal, after the International Criminal Court has already decided that they should put out an arrest warrant for Putin for, guess what? War crimes, the kidnapping of Ukrainian children, considering that he won't say he wants this side or that side. One side he said is being genocided to win. He doesn't want the people who are being genocided to win in their own liberation. He's not willing to say that. He's not willing to condemn these war crimes. He's not willing to go out there and call it what it is. This just feels like both sides-ing. He wants to get in there at day one, be like, Ukraine, sorry, it is what it is. You got to abandon Crimea. You got to abandon Donetsk. You got to abandon Luhansk. You got to abandon Zaporozhye. You got to abandon Kherson. You have to demilitarize. You have to give up everything. The Russians might invade you again in 5 years. Tough shit, we won't be there for you. And by the way, if we were to ask her, if the Russians invade again, do we put in our official military? Do we go back in? Do we send aid then? The answer is going to be no, because libertarians, at the end of the day, their answer to everything is do nothing. Do nothing on the international stage. And that's what aggravates me so much, is I thought Hannah Cox was one of those reasonable libertarians. Libertarians that could deal with critique, libertarians that are going to be somewhat reasonable on the social issues. But every time you get into the foreign policy sphere, when you boil it down, libertarians don't have answers. They don't have answers on how their foreign policy decisions are going to impact millions of people. They don't have answers on how their foreign policy decisions are based upon either junky or just completely falsified history, how much of their foreign policy critique comes from a lack of knowledge. For example, the idea that we can't support Ukraine. They could never win a war with a nuclear superpower. That comes without a knowledge about what happened in Afghanistan twice, what happened in Chechnya during the first Chechen war, what happened in Lebanon, what happened in all these other countries that have fought wars against nuclear powers. Algeria beat the French. Hell, the Vietnamese beat the French, and then the Vietnamese beat us. And now we're saying that a country with much more military capacity in its backing, much more military capacity in its pockets, can't beat the Russians? Hell, when we backed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, that was a 10-year war that contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they didn't use their nuclear arsenal. And we're saying that's impossible? That a bunch of guerrillas in caves can do it, but the Ukrainians with HIMARS and a contested airspace can't do it. Just seems kind of silly to me. Definitely when we're seeing the Russians fall back, whether it be on the flanks of Bakhmut, whether it be from Kharkiv, whether it be from Kherson. It's not like the Russian line is immovable, and there's no way they can retreat from their positions. So her painting it as a fairy tale, it's starting to feel a little bit more like those people at the start of the war who were like, the Russians will never invade. That's what it's starting to sound more and more like.
Labeling somebody as a war criminal is the military-industrial complex's excuse to come in and murder them and carry out regime change. And Putin is very well aware of that. But
it might also just be because you're a war criminal. Like, oh, maybe they called Hitler a war criminal because, you know, and I'm sorry, I'm doing the evil thing. I'm comparing Putin to World War II because they wanted to remove. Well, it could also be because he's a war criminal. It might also be that Milosevic was a war criminal. It might also be that Omar al-Bashir was a war criminal, and that's why he's wanted by the ICC. It might be that a lot of these people are just war criminals. It might be that people want them gone, but it's also because they're war criminals. And when it comes to Vladimir Putin, he is a war criminal. And so you can pretend that it's just because Donald Trump here wants to, you know, he wants to make negotiation easier. At the start, the ship has already sailed on that. He already declared that it's a genocide. You cannot be committing a genocide without committing war crimes. That's impossible. If he already said that Putin's government is committing genocide, then he already implied at the start of this war that he's a war criminal. Is he reversing his position? Is he going to have to come out and say, in the past I said Putin committed war crimes, I reversed that? He doesn't, which is going to look like more of an endorsement of Putin's actions, which is going to be like more of a denial of reality. When we see the scale of these war crimes, we're seeing the largest mass graves in Europe, over 440 bodies, and one mass grave in Izium. We've got the Bucha massacre. We've got massacres all across the board, cities literally being leveled to dust. And the president of the United States, who has previously declared it a genocide, is now tongue-tied when asked if the person committing the genocide he accused Russia of committing is a war criminal. Seems silly to me. The ICC already determined this decision. He could just be like, look, the ICC says this. I personally am going to refuse from saying that, but he won't even cite that. That would be the most moderate way he could do it. He won't do that because he wants to keep a cordial relationship with Vladimir Putin.
By the way, regime change hasn't worked out so good for us. Most of the time,
Japan, Germany, like it is true that most of the time when regime change happen in the more modern history of America, it hasn't ended well. But whether or not that should determine if we support Ukraine in throwing back the Russian invasion does not necessarily mean we change the government in Russia. Also, if Russia's natural evolution from losing a war is their government changes, that's a good thing.
It has led to the rise of terrorist organizations. It has led to even worse dictators seizing control of countries.
That's, you know what? She's making a very valid point. I hadn't considered this. Maybe if the Russian government collapses, they might start invading countries. That would be dastardly. I hope they don't do that.
It has destabilized entire regions. It's gotten tons of people killed.
Thankfully, the path that's being that we're advocating here for now, which is abandon the Ukrainians, would get no one killed. Not like our air defense system has saved thousands of lives or anything.
Cost billions of dollars, and it's resulted in blowback against the U.S. for our foreign policy with events like 9/11. So can we please stop? The best outcome.
If we support Ukraine, before you know it, there's going to be Russian hijackers flying planes into the White House, and we're going to have to go and kill Russian Al-Qaeda, the remnants of Wagner in Siberia, man.
In this conflict is a peaceful negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, and yes, that probably would involve Ukraine giving up some ground. Worth it.
Look, it's worth it, man. They'll be in the mass graves, and my gas prices will be lower. It's a win-win scenario. God, man. She is so mightier than thou, but then acted very, very incredulous on Twitter about the reception she received. I don't know. Maybe she didn't speak so mightier than thou and so above it all in the way she responded while also having very little historical knowledge. Maybe she would have gotten a better reception. I understand. You know, it sucks to be dogpiled on the internet, but man, that did not come off well. I'm freely willing to talk to her about her position. I'm freely willing to talk to her about what Trump said. I was going to offer this when I did do this reaction on stream, but I've been blocked since then, so I don't think she would be very interested. Which I mean, it isn't surprising because it feels like she kind of started to talk about this topic with very little knowledge. So it wouldn't be that surprising that she would be uncomfortable having this conversation outside of the isolationist sphere that she walks in.